So Dr. Ed Keystone, it's an honor and a privilege and a pleasure to have you here in the Arthritis Consumer Expert Office. We are really happy to be working with the Canadian Rheumatology Research Consortium to help inform patients and the general public about clinical trials and arthritis in general, and in particular inflammatory forms of the disease, which is your area of specialité, as they say. Yeah. So thank you for joining us.
It's a privilege and a pleasure to be with you.
Excellent. So Ed, I guess we want to start at the beginning, as things usually start. How long have you been practicing rheumatology?
I guess it would be about 35 years.
Yeah.
I've been practicing. Yeah, I graduated in 1974 as a rheumatologist, in fact.
How long is the training period? Like, how long does it take to become one?
You have to.
Back in the day, I guess.
Back in the day, you had 3 years of internal medicine and then another 2 years of rheumatology. So 5 years after you interned, after you finished internship.
And today, what does that pathway look like?
The pathway is similar. It's similar. You do internal medicine for a couple of years, and then you move into your specialty.
Okay. Why did you choose rheumatology?
Well, it's kind of an interesting question because I went into allergy immunology first.
Yeah.
And during the allergy year, they made me do a certain amount of time in research. That was part of my course. So the research was on rheumatoid arthritis. It was understanding the immune system in rheumatoid, the defense system, and why those cells in the patient's body attack their tissues. And so at the end of the year, I liked rheumatology more than I liked allergy. And I was fortunate that Murray Urwitz and the crowd there, Hugh Smythe, asked me if I would consider switching into rheumatology. But I want to tell you the one thing that really caught me, not just doing the research, but actually the type of patients that had arthritis. It seemed to me back then that arthritis patients were second-class citizens. If you didn't have a heart problem, a kidney problem, a lung problem, you've only got arthritis. What's the problem? And I began to realize that people were so grateful for you to care about them and pay attention to them. It made me feel good. It made them feel good because I really felt that we really wanted to raise up the level of understanding of this condition.
Well, people like me are very thankful that you chose immunology, rheumatology over allergy. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. It's the best thing that ever happened to me.
When you reflect on your career, Ed, what stands out in your mind? What's the sort of picture you see?
What I see is from almost death and dying in a hospital to being up, alive, well, and back doing what the patients want to do. The change in how patients are doing now compared to how they did years ago is a sea change, day and night. I mean, you had 40 beds at the Wellesley Hospital, and I would say 35 of those beds were filled with patients with rheumatoid arthritis.
That's in Toronto?
In Toronto.
Yeah.
Severe disease, difficulty getting out of bed, all sorts of complications. And at that time, all we cared about was trying to make them feel better because we didn't have enough medication around to actually put out the fire.
Right.
What I've seen in the last number of years is the amazing understanding of the disease, the new technology, the biotechnology that allows us now to actually shoot for, not they're going to feel better, but shoot for remission. So our whole modus operandi has changed. And I must say, it's gone from oncology in a sense, where you weren't doing much, to actually making a huge difference to the patients.
Yeah, I think in the work that we do here at ACE, we certainly see that people, their experience of the disease is so different than when I first got the disease.
Absolutely right. It's a very different disease now.
Yeah.
And it's because of the therapy, it's because of strategies to treat the patient, and it's lovely. It's good, not only good for the patient, obviously critically, but the docs finally feel that they can do something for their patients. It makes everybody feel good.
That you have some worth. You have a toolkit that's really effective.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
That's great.
Huge difference.
Great. So Ed, when you first started practice, what were the treatment options like?
Well, when I first started to treat patients, there wasn't much on the horizon at that point. You had prednisone or steroid, that's what everybody used. You had gold therapy. You had Plaquenil, which is an anti-malarial drug. And that was about it.
Is that like 25 years ago?
Yes, that's about 30 years ago,
30
right
years.
In the 70s.
Okay.
In the mid-70s, that's what we had to deal with.
Okay.
And then slowly sulfasalazine moved into place. And then I would say the most important development was methotrexate. Even though people worry about it as a big chemotherapy, it is a chemotherapy at this level, at a very small level.
Right.
You used 100 times the dose when you talk about chemotherapy for methotrexate. We use 100 times less of the dose. And that really changed the landscape for rheumatoid arthritis in terms of therapy. Years. And finally, about 15 years ago, again, there was a whole new step up in the process of treating rheumatoid arthritis, and that was the development of the biologics.
Right.
Those are the materials created from living tissue that selectively target the abnormalities in the joint. So if you think of rheumatoid as being a fire, heat going on all the time, causing redness, pain, swelling, and you think there are a number of different oils in that fire that's driving it, because of the biotechnology that we could create something that could remove a particular oil and therefore take the heat down, it was this kind of thing where we selectively target the abnormalities within the joint. We didn't have to carpet bomb the immune system. We could target selectively.
So it's like throwing a dart.
Exactly.
It was a much more precise exercise than
before
just
it was throwing a grenade.
Right.
Threw a grenade in.
Right.
Level everything.
Right.
Now we're actually selectively targeting, and it has made an enormous difference. And that's in patients that fail methotrexate. So methotrexate is still the standard for the treatment of rheumatoid. And if you fail that, that's where these new therapies come. The earlier you start a disease-modifying drug, such as methotrexate or gold or anything, the more likely you are to achieve complete remission.
Right.
The longer you wait and start the same drug, the less likely you are to get where you need to be.
Right. Do you think, so in your excitement, which is contagious, it's your enthusiasm is contagious, do you think patients have come along with you? Do you think they're as aware from the patient perspective that there's been such a sea change in our ability to better treat the disease?
I honestly think if you look at the whole rheumatoid population of people coming to a doctor, a family doctor, absolutely not. They have no idea what we're able to accomplish. And it's only getting to the rheumatologist and those rheumatologists that in fact use these medications, because there's still lots of rheumatologists that really are very concerned and very conservative, step back, and a lot of things still happen before they can shut down. If you adopt these new therapies earlier and know that the earlier the better, you can make a huge difference. So I think patients after a while begin to understand, but for the first while they think everything's going to be just like it was years ago. When you think about it, 15 years ago, we had about 4 or 5 at the most medications, and the only one that really worked well was methotrexate. Now there are 8 new medications from 15 years ago to today, each one of them as good, if not better, than methotrexate. So it's a whole new world.
So these new therapies that are coming down in the next couple of years, these are, I understand, pills.
They are the pills.
So if you recall me standing up at scientific meetings of years gone by, I would say, okay, well, where's the pill that works as well as these infusions and injections?
And it is. Those pills, the first one's going to be out in another few months in Canada.
Right.
And then there'll be another one in a year or two, and there's 3 or 4 or 5 on the line coming down. And those medications are at least as good as a biologic. Now, remember, they've just come out, so there's still safety you have to watch over time and make sure that there's no long-term issues. But from the short-term perspective, they act quicker. They probably have fewer side effects in some ways than the biologics. And in fact, I think it's another sea change. It's another step up in our pyramid of therapy.
And what I see as a patient is that option.
Absolutely.
That choice of options is just broader.
Huge.
And the way I take the medication is broader.
Absolutely.
I have a choice, and I think choice is critical.
Huge for the patient.
Yeah.
Huge for the patient.
So research in arthritis has has gone bonkers.
It has. It's gone
How's
bonkers.
that for a technical scientific
It's gone
word?
bonkers. It's gone bonkers.
And the potential for living well with the disease because of that has improved significantly. Can you talk a little bit about where we are today and kind of what's behind that transformation?
I think the most important part of the transformation in terms of helping patients is two things.
Yeah.
One is a better understanding of the disease itself, and number two is the biotechnology that's available to create the new therapies, and number three, our understanding that we really need to treat early and aggressively. So it's not just only the therapies, it's the strategies to use these therapies that has made a huge difference. Combination therapy. Start immediately with methotrexate. Get the patient on a medication the day they walk in the door, you make the diagnosis. You don't wait for something to happen. So the strategies around treatment, plus the new technology, plus the understanding of the disease, you put all that together, it's made an enormous difference.
It highlights for me how it's not just about what's happening in a petri dish
Right.
or back in the lab and making
Right.
these meds. It's your expertise and your rich knowledge base paired with this emerging research and technology together
Right.
that makes a difference for
Yeah.
patients.
Yeah.
It's that unique combination
It is
of
huge.
tools. Yeah.
We still have a lot of unmet needs,
Yeah.
but the science is moving in the right direction. So the science is looking for predictors of getting arthritis, for predictors of who's going to respond to what medication, to predict what the outcome is going to be. So instead of being guess and toss a coin to see what medication you're going to use, you target for the patient, which is called personalized health care.
So this is the buzz. These are the buzzwords we hear now.
Yeah. And that's what we're going for.
Yeah.
That's what we're going. That's why I say we are developing a clinic, for example, which is very unique. You look at the children, the aunts and the uncles of patients with rheumatoid, and these people don't have rheumatoid, but we actually have blood tests. We can do tests, their genetics, proteins, and we can predict more and more who's going to get it. And if we can predict even before they get it, then our concept is if the prediction is high enough and the likelihood of getting it is high enough, we will treat them before they get it and prevent disease. At the end of the day, it's all about prevention.
That is stunning. That will be a stunning advance.
Huge advance.
Yeah.
But all over the world, people are working in this area now. We started with established clinics in RA, and you follow people. And that's called surveillance databases. You follow and see how they do. Then they moved to early RA. The minute you make the diagnosis, you put them into a program where you use surveillance over time.
Right.
Now we move one step further and we say, let's have the people before they get it. And let's look at surveillance databases of those people over time.
That is so exciting because at research meetings that you and I have been going to for years, I know that the patients that attend these have been saying, when you ask them to close their eyes and have a dream about the future of rheumatoid arthritis, let's use that as an example, what would that dream look like? And the answer we get back more often than not is, I don't want my grandchildren to have to deal with what I deal with.
Right. And that's where we're going.
I know. It's
exactly where we're going.
It's inspiring.
It's exciting. It's fantastic. It really is. And I think the other part of that is the kinds of studies that we do to find out how to better treat patients.
Yeah.
So we have the classic clinical trial. It's a study. You study to see if the drug works, it's effective, and look for its side effects. That's one step. But you have and I think the other part of that is the kinds of studies that we do to find out how to better treat patients.
Yeah.
So we have the classic clinical trial. It's a study. You study to see if the drug works, it's effective, and look for its side effects. That's one step. But you have selected populations in that study. You have to select them carefully. You've got another group that's real-world people, and you watch them over time in surveillance databases. There's even government databases because they, capture all of the information such as who's going to the doctor, how much it costs, what about hospitalization, is there a mortality or death rate with it? So we have a whole range of information now rather than just one little piece of information to understand the patient for the therapy immediately, long-term therapy, and long-term outcomes. And all of that comes together to really enhance our knowledge of the patient.
Right, and I think the public, just by talking about these types of research, these types of databases that exist, it helps them to understand how you make a specific recommendation to one person.
Absolutely.
It's by following a lot of people
Absolutely.
so that you can make a generalization for
Correct.
one individual.
Absolutely
Yeah.
correct.
Yeah.
It's all about the patient.
Yeah.
It's all about the patient.
Yeah. So Ed, your research interest is clinical trials of new therapeutics. So
That is
all of
absolutely
these
right.
things that we've been talking about to this point. From a clinician researcher's perspective, what makes this area to you, to Ed Keystone, appealing?
Well,
Why do you do it?
I do it because it is the most exciting area. It's the forefront of knowledge. You are changing knowledge and you are helping patients. Every trial that you do provides a new potential therapy which will change the life of the patient. So who doesn't want to be at the forefront of research? Who doesn't want to be out there knowing that everything you do will have an impact on the patient?
I understand that there are challenges with the current clinical trials environment, and maybe you can tell me a little bit about that.
There are major issues now with clinical trials in Canada and the US, in North America basically. The good news is there's a lot of new medications out there. I just told you about some of them. The bad news is that people don't appreciate that they may only last or work for a certain period of time.
Right.
It's frequent that they lose effect over time.
Right.
So that we can say for any medication almost right now, 10% of patients every year will drop off because they will lose the effect or have a side effect. So by 5 years, 50% of patients that were on one therapy will have to move to another.
That's certainly been my experience.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the more you move to another therapy, the more therapies you fail, the harder it is to get you under control.
Right.
So people say, well, there's all these medications out there. Why should I do a clinical trial? And I have to remind people, because you don't know whether you're going to be that next person that requires a new therapy. So it's hard to recruit people when there are many medications. That's the good news. In the sense there are many medications. The bad news is because of that, people don't appreciate that, in fact, this may not be lifelong and that we have to continue to bring new therapies to the fore.
Right. So obviously you've just highlighted some of the reasons why it's still important to do trials when
Right.
we have so many treatment options. Does the Canadian experience with new therapies, does it ultimately improve access to medications and therefore patient
Yes.
health outcomes?
Without a doubt.
Yeah.
Without a doubt.
Yeah.
If trials were to disappear in Canada,
Yeah.
it would take longer for any new therapy to come into Canada. That's number one. Most importantly, even if it came into Canada, it would take it longer for the rheumatologist to use it, to adopt it. The people that are rapid adopters, that adopt the new therapies, are those that do clinical trials. And who's going to teach the community rheumatologists that don't do trials about the therapy? But they do trust their opinion leaders. And if you lose trials, you lose opinion leaders.
Right.
If you lose opinion leaders, you lose the use of these new therapies for the patient. It'll be years before they get onto it instead of months.
Right.
So it is a huge issue. Huge issue.
Are there other consequences that perhaps government or clinicians aren't thinking of when we look at this sort of exodus of clinical trials out of Canada?
I think government is finally getting
They're
it.
getting it.
They're getting it because it's also an important part of our whole industry of research and knowledge base.
Right.
And if the knowledge is moving out of the country, then Canada doesn't have the same ability to grow and thrive with it.
Right.
So governments are now very concerned about what's happening with clinical trials.
And citizens should be as well, because they're patients.
Well, at the end of the day, it's all
Right.
about the patient. At
Right.
the end of the day, the patient will not get the medication that they need as soon as they need it.
Right.
You want the right drug for the right patient at the right time.
Right.
And at the right time isn't going to happen if clinical trials disappear.
So, Ed, what is the potential for research in the future? What do you see? You close your eyes and you click your heels.
Yes. I think that this is the most exciting time ever in the history of the treatment of arthritis. And I say that because of what I told you about, that is the research into the area of arthritis, understanding the mechanism of disease,
Right.
associated in tandem with the new technology, allows us to move a millennium. And when you think about it, a number of years ago, we could actually code the whole genome. Now we're taking that information and coding the genome in rheumatoid arthritis. And we're taking that information and adding some proteins to it and understanding other types of markers to diagnose, predict. And it's all about prediction. Because instead of tossing a coin and saying there's 9 on the market, 9 drugs,
Right.
let's pick one, it's this person gets this drug for this reason.
Right.
And then you don't have them go through a series of things, of medications, they get it right off the bat.
Right. So I'm going to really put you on the spot by saying, okay, how far away? Is it going to happen in my lifetime?
Well, and I'll answer the question very simply. About a few years ago, to do the human genome cost $100,000 per person. It now costs $10,000 per person in the last couple of years. Now, within a few years, it's going to be $100 per person.
Okay.
It means
it's like the price of VCRs in the past.
You got it. We're going to be taking that technology and using it on a daily basis.
Right.
And everybody knows it, and that's why we have databases, that's why we have genetics, that's why we have these other so-called protein biomarkers that mark what's happening to the patient. And, I used to say I predicted we'd cure rheumatoid arthritis about 25 years ago.
You weren't alone. It's okay.
I said it. So I won't give you a time frame. I'll just say that in the next 10 years, I see a dramatic change in how we actually treat patients based on the knowledge we have today. How long ago, Cheryl, were you diagnosed with rheumatoid and osteoarthritis? And what was your journey from diagnosis to treatment?
Oy vey. So, it's been about 24 years.
Mm-hmm.
The journey was started very quickly.
Mm-hmm.
I was a high-performance athlete and wheelchair-bound in about a year.
Wow.
After diagnosis. Multiple swollen joints. Didn't listen to my doctor, should have. My rheumatologist, rather.
Mm-hmm.
Got a speedy diagnosis, but didn't follow doctor's orders. So didn't do very well. Once I sort of smartened up, as my mom would say, I began to listen to their instruction. I learned more about the disease. I figured out what rheumatoid arthritis was through their help. Reached out, looked at information that was available out in the community, and then began to understand I wasn't alone. I got over the denial. I began taking the right treatment, and it took about 4 or 5 years with the traditional treatments, the ones that are slower acting,
right.
Before I felt about 30% better. 30% of 100% of me. It took me that long. So fast onset, shocking. I couldn't believe it. I was in my mid-20s.
It happened to you.
It happened to me.
Right. And I understand that you eventually went on to biologic therapy, and there was a big difference after that.
Massive, yeah. After I was sort of approaching 10 years into my disease, 10 or 12 years into my disease, biologics came along. I was in a clinical trial. 12 hours after my first dose, I was able to lace my fingers with my husband's because the inflammation literally overnight disappeared.
Fantastic.
It was a stunning result.
Okay. Yeah. And you really are the poster child for methotrexate and then a biologic, and the combination which has clearly put you in a whole new era.
It totally has. I went from being probably about 40% of my 100% on a triple combination of the older drugs.
Right.
Dumped a couple of those, kept the methotrexate, added a biologic, and I went to almost up to 80%, I would say. I got 80% of my 100% life back.
Fantastic.
Which in rheumatology, as you know, is Stunning.
Stunning.
A stunning result.
Stunning. When you think back to the time when you were diagnosed, what do you think the level of arthritis patient engagement was, and where was the consumer movement at that time?
It didn't exist. I think there were a handful of people. I have to tell you, a colleague of mine who has since passed had rheumatoid arthritis forever, it seemed, Anne Qualman.
Oh, right.
Anne Qualman and myself, and probably a couple of other people were beginning to receive invitations to meetings.
Right.
To attend as patients, quote unquote.
Right.
That was back in '96.
Right.
And it was with a view to get our input on what we should be doing when the clock turned and it became the year 2000. It was trying to move forward as a community. And it was at that time that I began to be involved, and I looked around me, and from coast to coast, there were 3 or 4 of us.
That's all?
That's it.
Wow.
Out of, 4.6 million
Yes.
Canadians who live with the disease. So it was a very lonely time. And I think it took some courage to open up one's mouth and say things that were very unfamiliar to people like yourself, scientists, researchers, clinicians, government. No one was hearing the consumer perspective at the time.
So that was back then.
Yeah.
At around 2000.
Yeah.
Where are we today in terms of the consumer movement?
Oh, it's like in your business, let's say. It's changed dramatically. We now have Arthritis Consumer Experts formed back in 2000, November of 2000.
Okay.
Shortly thereafter, the Canadian Arthritis Patient Alliance formed, the Canadian Arthritis Network's Consumer Advisory Council formed. Now we have probably 10 consumer groups in the span of 13 years that have formed and are surviving and thriving.
Great.
Working with clinical researchers like yourselves to include the patient perspective in the design of trials and studies, to share our views with government, to tell policymakers what we think good arthritis policy is and bad arthritis policy is. And I would say we have probably several hundred active, very informed and articulate arthritis consumers involved day to day, either on a volunteered or on a paid basis, actively being part of the community and changing the face of arthritis.
Fabulous.
Yeah, so it's been a sea change like it has been for you in the clinical arena.
I know you speak to many people about arthritis around the world and in Canada. How do people with arthritis view research these days?
Well, I think those of us who know people like you, who are really blessed to know and work and volunteer with people like you, are at a whole other level.
Okay.
When we look at the arthritis population in general, there are several hundred people probably in each country. Let's say the top 8, top 9, the industrialized world, if you will.
Right.
I think there's several hundred patients in each country now that are very involved and active in providing leadership to patients. And I think we know a lot about what's happening in research.
Right.
Maybe not at the granular level, not the nitty-gritty, but we understand what it is you're trying to do. We understand what databases are and clinical trials are, and we know what biologics are and how they differ from older disease drugs.
Right.
So we have a very good general understanding of research and what it can do at the individual level, how it can change my life. I think, though, still at the general arthritis population level, people don't really understand what researchers do day in and day out, why it takes so long from the beginning of a research project to the end to be able to hand us an answer.
Right. But how do you see the consumer with respect to their idea about clinical trials? if they don't appreciate research quite, and I understand that,
Yeah.
how are clinical trials perceived?
I think there probably is even less knowledge about clinical trials than about research in general.
Okay.
And I think people fall into a couple of different categories. One, there's a group that will always take the wait and see approach. Well, I don't
Right.
want to do that. I don't want to be a guinea pig.
Right.
And thankfully, there are quite a number of patients who, because the current therapies aren't effective,
Right.
or they think that they can even be better on a newer technology, an emerging technology,
Right.
an emerging medication, are willing to take that smaller amount of risk
Right.
to hopefully get a much greater benefit by being in this clinical trial program. I certainly have experienced it myself.
So you've actually
I have been
experienced clinical trial.
I have been in several clinical trials, drug trials.
Right.
As well, I've been in a number of non-drug studies.
Right.
And I think because of that experience, I certainly have understood the value of participating in clinical trials. One, it's not just that you get access to a medication that one, government or your private payer isn't likely going to be paying for,
Right.
or paying for anytime soon.
Right.
Two, I have a chance to do something good for my community. I get a chance to get better, but so does my community, because my community is going to learn through you what's happening in
Right.
this clinical trial. And three, I think I'm part of that community that is saying we deserve to have access to these therapies here in our country. We deserve to be involved in clinical trials. We deserve to have access to clinicians like you who have dedicated their lives to running clinical trials. So I think that group of patients who kind of understand what clinical trials are all about, have participated in them in the past, are willing to continue on and fight for them. There's still, though, a large number of patients who've never participated, and they could be better. The healthcare that you're given in a clinical trial, above and beyond your standard of care,
Right.
is like 10 times greater. I get, my blood pressure taken. I get all of these things done to me. My blood tests, my blood monitored, my liver function, my kidneys.
Right.
I get my health assessment questionnaire. My pain levels are scored every week or month or a couple of months, depending on the
Right.
trial. I get all of this extra health care that patients who are not enrolled in clinical trials are not getting,
Right.
and may not be doing as well as a result.
So you've had a good experience
I have.
with clinical trials.
I have.
But how do you reconcile then the issue of it's more work for the patient, there's an increased risk of side effects of a new therapy? How do you reconcile that versus what you just told me are the benefits of trials? How does a patient reconcile those two issues?
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, Ed, it really is about how well or not I'm doing personally in my health. So I reconcile it. Cheryl Koehn says,
Right.
geez, I could be better. I know I can be better on something more than I'm on now.
Okay.
I think it has to benefit the individual first. You have to reconcile the risk-benefit profile for yourself first. And when you do that, then you can be benevolent. Then you can say, well, gee, I know if I get in this trial and several others or hundreds of others are going to be in the trial, and we learn that it's a positive result and can be shared with a much broader pool of people, and then the medication gets approved and is then marketed in Canada, that's when the big payoff comes for the public.
Right.
But individually, I reconcile it by how well I'm doing at the time. Can I be better? It's not a willy-nilly decision, clearly.
Right.
But because of all this added health care that I've just mentioned, I don't fear the risk in a trial. Because I know by the time a person with disease gets in the trial, there have been several steps of testing before it comes to me.
Yes.
So I feel there's a measure of assurance there. And that's what sort of encourages me to join a trial.
And as we've talked about, one of the key problems right now is recruitment for trials.
Right.
Patients just are not available. to go into trials or do not want to participate. As a consequence, trial centers are closing across Canada.
I know.
And so how do we change that modus operandi where we have people more engaged and willing to do clinical trials? What's the way we can actually improve access to trials, and more importantly as well, is a willingness to participate in trials?
Well, I think one of the things that we can do is this. I think we can have this conversation with people like you and people like me who are actually working in the community and our patients.
Right.
I think we can expose people to a greater level or better quality of information about clinical trials,
Right.
so that they understand that this center in their community is at risk of not being there.
Right.
And highlighting the benefits that community gets from that center. There is an availability of trials and added care available to them if clinical trials survive and thrive in their community. And I don't think we do that all that well right now. And
what kind of strategies would you use now?
Web-based.
Okay.
We are going to be, through our partnership with the Canadian Rheumatology Research Consortium, we're going to be engaging in educational activities and talking about clinical trials much more so than we ever have in the past. We've been, I feel, not slow to pick up the ball and run with it. But now that we have picked up the ball and are running with it, we're going to teach people through our web workshops. We're going to expose them to information about clinical trials, their risk of as I said, that exodus from Canada and other countries, and what the impact will be for patients at the end of the day. Here's what happens to a patient when clinical trials survive and thrive in Canada.
Right.
Here's what happens when they don't. And I think it's really putting it into that black and white perspective. It's about using social media, talking to people the way they want to be talked to today versus the way we used to talk to people in the past. You know, we will have brochures sitting on rheumatology clinic tables near you soon. But we're also going to be doing it, as I said, through digital means. Engaging people, hopefully in pharmacies. We have a program now with Shoppers Drug Mart that's going live in September.
How do they start? What's the way that they can start that?
So I think being plugged into the community is an important step.
Okay.
And it might not be their first step,
Right.
But it's a very important one. And I think the rheumatology community is really a critical player in making that connection between patient and community.
Okay.
So as you said, this video hopefully is going to be playing in rheumatology offices. People are going to see it and they're going to go, hey, I want to learn more from people just like me.
Okay.
I want to go and get plugged into a consumer group like Arthritis Consumer Experts. You can go to jointhealth.org. You can go to the CRRC, your website.
Right.
That's why this partnership exists. They can pick up the phone and talk to us. They can come to our workshops. They can go to meetings in their community that our research community is holding. There are lots of opportunities for engagement, but they have to engage.
Right.
I think unless you plug in, unless you reach out and sort of go, that's an interesting, cookie in the cookie jar, and taste it, you're never going to know how great it is to be, not how great it is to have arthritis, because that's not great, even on the best of days.
Absolutely.
But how great it is to know that there's a rich community that's involved and working on their behalf.
Right.
I think they'll really get turned on by that.
So it sounds like the future is rosy for you.
It is.
Well, how do you see the future? What's your perspective of the future?
Well, I think because of rheumatology leadership like yours, you guys block tackle for us in the early days. I go, this is sort of reaching back to one of your first questions. What did it look like way back when? I think we really want to be taken seriously when it comes to talking to government about the importance of clinical trials, for example. As people living with the disease, we hold the moral authority in the community. we live with the disease every day, day in and day out, until you guys figure it out and
Right.
shut it all down for
Got it,
us.
got it.
We are the moral authority. So I guess I hope to see a greater appreciation for that moral authority in the future, at all levels of
Right.
decision making.
Right.
But I hope to see what you described at the beginning of our conversation, and that is no disease, no RA.
Right. Prevent it.
Prevent it. Let's
Prevent
get
it.
rid of the
Get
sucker.
rid of it. You
Yeah.
got it.
Yeah. So Ed, I can't thank you enough for joining me in our office. We are, as I said at the start of this conversation, our little fireside chat. We are really privileged to have your knowledge and expertise, but more importantly, your passion and your personal caring and love for your patients. It's touching, and we're lucky that you're here to serve a huge community of Canadians living with inflammatory arthritis. I think there's about 600,000.
Correct.
About 300,000 of us have rheumatoid arthritis. So we're very, very grateful that you've taken time to spend with us today, and also to lead the charge in the area of clinical trials, translating that knowledge into application out in the real world and getting people like me better. So thank you very, very much.
It is a privilege to work with you. A real privilege.
Thank you.
Okay?
Thanks.
And we are very lucky in the arthritis community to have your kind of leadership and your kind of guidance and your kind of enthusiasm to change the world of arthritis, is all I've got to say.
Thanks. Well, it sounds like a lovely mutual adoration club. So thank you very much.
It is.
Great.